always a joy.
Got it.
All right. So I'm going to go around alphabetically because I think that's just easiest, but maybe Amy, if you can start and just quickly introduce yourself and maybe define brain-computer interface, just so we're starting there. And then Ian and then Vivian, if you have anything to your nuanced or shade on that, that would be great too.
Yeah, sure. I'll give a very quick background on myself. Neuroscientist by training, have a PhD in neuroscience, followed a really crazy, non-traditional path, actually ended up moving out to Washington, D.C. and became a government program manager at DARPA. Stayed in the defense industry for a while, actually was a chief technology officer at a defense company, but then really got the bug to go back into neuroscience and was a scientific co-founder at a startup called Optios, using applied neuroscience for human performance. So something near and dear to my heart, not for defense, but for more, applied everyday uses, executive sports teams and things like that. Prime Movers Lab was actually the largest investor in our company, and that's how I got to meet the Prime Movers team. And so when I left Optios last year, joined Prime Movers first as a advisor, then as a partner, and now as a general partner. So happy to join Prime Movers Lab as a deep tech venture investing firm, breakthrough science, potential and impact billions of lives, which of course neurotechnology is in our human augmentation space. And then very quickly, I take a very broad definition of brain-computer interfaces. I really view it as the ability to sense something that's going on in the brain and affect an outcome based on that, whether that's controlling a robotic arm, whether that's controlling an interface. It can really have quite a broad sense, certainly include neuromodulation in that space. So I take a very broad brushstrokes there because I think the space is much, much bigger than just like motor control of prosthetics or speech or something like that. So yeah, that's my 2 cents. Happy to pass it along.
I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm Ian. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hum. I co-founded Hum, which is a company making a neuromodulation device about 5 years ago now in Western Australia, after coming out of a law degree and science degree with my co-founder, Dr. Fury, who is an early career surgeon. We'd been really passionate studying neuroscience technology, what we call Neurotech, which is kind of an even broader world than BCI, almost, for about 5 years before that, and had got really excited after participating in a trial using something called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which was able to make my arms and legs move around, which was really cool. In the last 5 years, have been really focused on how do we educate the public and create technology for them that is really helpful and useful and solutions focused. And in that way, I actually have kind of a little bit different of a vision of BCI or definition of BCI, I think, than a lot of people, because I'm really focused on trying to think about how we can use the interface to help. And so I think you can do a lot of things just like watching data on a screen and stuff like that. And that's commonly where BCI goes, and like tracking emotions and feelings and things like that. I'm really interested in the form of BCI that can actually directly cause a change, or that can cause us to be able to make a direct change. And so whereas I think a lot of people think of BCI as like neuroprosthetics, where you can control arms and things like that, I spend much more of a day-to-day focusing on the version of BCI that can use computers to help us understand the brain and then make interventions.
Well, I'll finish it out here then. So I'm Vivian Ming, and started my life as a theoretical neuroscientist, which I think in the language of the rest of the neuroscience community actually means lazy neuroscientists. So we are kind of like theoretical physicists trying to look at the mathematics that might describe why the brain works the way it does. But then I got kind of hooked on the idea that you could use these algorithms to do real things in the real world. Because it turns out those algorithms ended up becoming the kind of deep neural networks that have come to be the face of modern artificial intelligence. But in my heart, I mean, when I went to grad school more than 20 years ago, I told people I wanted to build cyborgs. And most of them thought I was crazy and scooted away from me so that my crazy wouldn't rub off on them. But I had the opportunity, to actually work, for example, take one of my purely theoretical models of hearing. Why do we hear the way we do, and actually use it to improve cochlear implants for people that are profoundly deaf, and create a big boost. So again, 20 years ago, to actually design some math on a computer, and then a year later, people that were profoundly deaf could actually understand what people were saying to them. It kind of gets you hooked on the idea that these are achievable things.
Yeah.
So after I was a neuroscientist at CMU, Stanford, and Cal, I started my first company doing educational technology. I sort of needed a pause. I wanted to build cyborgs, but it didn't feel like the world was ready for it yet. So I built an ed tech company, and then another one, and then companies using AI in hiring. I actually just founded my 6th company recently, but it turned out I was wrong. We were about to get back to the world of cyborgs. It's always fun for me to use scary language, but it's also worth understanding. So the first version of a BCI I ever saw was, I think, the classic. It was for typing, for people that were profoundly paralyzed. Using EEG, so nothing invasive, just activity that you could pick up on the surface of your brain, and typing a couple of characters a minute. I mean, it was slow. But of course, if you couldn't move any other part of your body, then it was something. And I remember people trying to start startups back then with the claim that became emerging for me and Ian originally, which was, I bet gamers would pay for this just to get a 1% boost in their proficiency in some way. So obviously in the years since, things have changed a lot, and I'll wrap myself up here by saying, so nowadays I get to sit on the boards or advisory boards of a number of neurotechnologies companies with that broad term that Ian was using, but some of them are very much in a space. And in fact, one of them is specifically cognition, focused around mobility, cognitive mobility, as well as literal mobility for people with things like ALS and MLS and other profound stroke. And, that's a closed loop neural interface system, not so wildly dissimilar to what we were fiddling with 20 years ago, but with so much faster technology, with higher bandwidths and deep neural networks to help with the processing. But, one of these organizations is Hum, that I've been advising for a while, and even one of Amy's past companies I had my moment of input on as well. And so it's really amazing seeing these things go from science fiction to basic science, and now products on the market, looking at Alzheimer's, looking at MS, at kids with traumatic brain injury, and, now beginning to emerge into sort of an inevitable state of, I use this to study for tests, or can it help smooth my mood through the day, which are things, boy, we should really be talking about, which is why I like to be provocative in talking about this stuff, so that we don't treat it like it's science fiction, because it will be real a lot faster than we appreciate.
Yeah, so you said something which I think we should just make certain everybody's got a good understanding of, which is closed loop. And so does somebody want to give a great example or definition of closed loop versus open loop stimulation, just so everybody's on the same page?
I've been mouthy.
Sure.
If you guys want me to talk and talk, trust me. But,
no.
Amy,
I mean, I was just gonna jump in and say, closed loop meaning, completing the loop, right? So measuring something about the brain, affecting something in, I would say reality, right? Whether that's a computer interface or other interface, and then again, that information feeding back to the brain. So open loop meaning you do something to the brain, you're not really measuring it, you're not really changing that information cycle based on the state of the brain. Closed loop, you're actually changing the interface or other effector based on the state of the brain in real time. And it can be, something that learns, it can be something that doesn't learn, it can be something that's algorithmically based. But yeah, that's what we mean by closed loop.
Great, thanks. The other thing is, all three of you touched on this, which I think is really interesting, is there are all these therapeutic things. And then Vivian, you started to talk about some of the non-therapeutic ways that BCI can be used. I would love for all of you just to share like something on both realms you're really excited about, like what really excites you on the therapeutic front and what really excites you, or what do you think might be coming on the non-therapeutic front, just for wellness or for enjoyment?
Oh, I can go on and on. So, and I will. So in fact, we've got two ends in two other of my companies. One is Opticutics, that's working on phasic light therapy for Alzheimer's. Now, the idea here is that using sensory stimulus, so instead of interfacing with the brain with magnets or electrical stimulation and or plugging into it in some sense, and I think we could have a fascinating talk about a lot of cool invasive technologies that are on near horizons. But in this particular case, we're actually just talking about using sensory stimulation. And here, a very clever technology, you create a big flicker at about 30 hertz. So imagine I'm looking at a 60-inch screen right now with everybody's face on it, and we can get that whole thing to flicker. And it turns out when you do that, parts of your brain synchronize with that flickering, particularly back here, your visual centers, your occipital lobe. But it turns out for various reasons, you begin to see that synchrony happening in other parts as well. Well, what's exciting about that work, both with our group at Berkeley and in Copenhagen, as well as another team at MIT, is finding that originally in rats and also in people, that it decreases the symptomology of Alzheimer's and decreases things like plaque load. So this is incredibly exciting, this idea of being able to get in front of something and having it flicker, and the MIT team, for example, pairs it with a loud sound. This is like black site experience. You would never willingly sign up for this unless, of course, you had Alzheimer's. The cool invention at Opticutics was this famous trick of light, which you can create any light by making a combination, any color of light, by making a combination of 3 other lights. So they thought, well, what if we just circled that light space, and then you could create a flicker, which in theory was imperceptible, but was still actually there. And that was, so their vision is being able to build this into everything and have it be a chronic treatment for people experiencing neurodegeneration. So that's one end of the space. Your everyday appliances potentially addressing one of the great harms to humanity. The other end of the space is a company so new that I don't even know what its most recent name is, but another former postdoc of mine who is actually looking at writing. She is using EEG to monitor people's consumption of media online and recording it jointly with memory and saliency. And then later when you're writing, it automatically pulls up related content that you've seen in the past that's in the same semantic, cognitive, emotional space. And I mean, I built something like this for myself years and years ago without the neuroscience angle, just some fancy machine learning. And this idea that you could begin to write an article and then grab a paragraph out of it and highlight it and say, give me every paper I've ever read that's related to this. And just pops up in the sidebar. And then again, adding an element here. Well, what if you didn't even have to explicitly record all of those articles? You're just reading them, and a combination of machine learning and neuroactivity picks up on the saliency and your unique definition of similarity. And so, having been confronted with this challenge in the past, I really got why it was special. And, both of the co-founders of those companies came from the academic side of my life, and brought something obviously wildly different into the world, both originally from UC Berkeley and now out creating these technologies. And it really bookends, like we say. I mean, I think given that many of the people listening here are writers themselves, you probably don't think the ability of pulling all this stuff out of the ether is a trivial thing. But, you know, for most people, that's not their first thought of an area that desperately needs a neurotechnology. But boy, I do. You know, as someone that writes a lot about very complicated scientific topics, you know, being able to pull these things, and I have a terrible memory for names. I cannot remember anybody's name ever. And so searching the stuff back out again, or asking my research team to go find it, and they don't know because they don't have the expertise. So it was amazing having these two things come together. So there you go. There's from Alzheimer's to writing about Alzheimer's.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll maybe emphasize something that people think of when they think of the clinical applications, right? So thinking of the neuroprosthetics, but thinking of now where, like the next generation, right? So I had the very, very privileged front row seat to be, you know, at DARPA as a program manager during the revolutionizing prosthetics revolution, right? And to see where those technologies have come to today, right? So not just controlling a cursor or not just controlling a robotic arm, but now closing the loop where somebody can actually sense something in a limb that they, you know, haven't been able to move for decades, right? Or having the robotic interface actually move their arm for them. Thinking about memory prosthetics, thinking about, you know, what Vivian just said about memory and Alzheimer's and traumatic brain injury. Now we have, you know, neuroprosthetics that have been shown to be able to input, you know, direct invasive electrical stimulation into the brain and actually improve memory functioning in individuals who have been compromised. You know, just thinking about how those interfaces from their very earliest days of, like, you know, pokey pronged electrodes now to, you know, sheets of electrodes that can be placed on the cortex and used in controlling epilepsy. You know, think about where deep brain stimulation has come, you know, in the treatment of Parkinson's, and now thinking about closing the loop in that interface, right, including other types of interface. So really on the neuroprosthetic space, I've always been amazed and continues to be amazed at how, you know, those technologies have matured. In the non-invasive space, I will say I'm really excited about neuromodulation, kind of, again, writ large, right? So whether that's TACS, right, TDCS, right, TMS, right? So electrical, magnetic, focused ultrasound, right? Focused ultrasound has been now used to actually, you know, low intensity focused ultrasound, the type of, you know, same kind of, when you think of ultrasound, you think of it as an imaging system, right? But now it can actually be used to stimulate the brain. And you know, those of us who grew up in the neuroscience world, probably Vivian and I were from the same era. It was a very reductionist kind of approach, right? You know, it was piecing things apart. And now I think with some of these technologies, we're really able to understand the brain as a network, as a system of systems, and how mental illness and other disturbances in the brain are really sort of problems of network, right? Not just maybe one little tiny synapse and trying to, like, tweak things at that level. And so really excited about neuromodulation from a non-invasive perspective. First, of course, I think we'll see some clinical applications with it, but also I think much more accessible stimulation applications, whether that is for memory or focus or sleep or you know, some other type of state-based thing. So those are the things I'm sort of, you know, still kind of jazzed about. So,
you know, riffing off that just a tiny bit, it is interesting how over these decades, I think the idea of BCI has gone from my neurons controlling something out in the world to almost the opposite, right? When we think, for example, about what Hum is doing, and I mentioned Optoceutics and a few others, it's the idea that there's some subtly other me, one that isn't profoundly hampered with dementia, or one that has a slightly better working memory or better emotion regulation, or, oh my goodness, get into, there's this thing, ventral tegmental area and the dorsal cingulate cortex is get really complicated, but your sense of body ownership and even what consciousness is, and the idea that it gets super complicated if we really get into, all of these saliency networks and steady state networks and so forth. But the idea of really modulating you, that the nature of BCI is something that is bidirectional. And that does seem to be part of the plot of the Dr. Octopus version of the Spider-Man universe. But nonetheless, I think we can clearly see what would be amazing in being able to, as I mentioned before, take a kid with traumatic brain injury, or take someone, how many people have profound executive control issues. They're very impulsive, and help them slowly change that aspect of themselves through combining, and I think maybe this is the near-term reality, combining powerful new neurotechnologies with just effort, but, using those things to make the effort really pay off.
I think what I would add.
Bring us home, Ian.
Yeah. When I think about what excites me, there's so many things day to day that I read that are really fascinating developments that are ongoing. And, just to list off a couple of them, like lately, it's a really interesting idea what Brian Johnson and Kernel are working on to try and increase the amount of information that we can get non-invasively to, validate lots of products and things that are entering the ecosystem. There was really interesting work that I was reading earlier today. It was using MRI, so not particularly scalable, but to identify when someone was thinking about an abstract concept or thought or feeling pretty accurately, more accurately than I thought was possible until I read that. But the thing that I think often gets left out is just that there's a really big part of this is not just science and technology as well. Just like when personal computers became more powerful, often the power of technology moves out ahead of user behavior and understanding. And a thing that really excites me is, it's not particularly objectively exciting, maybe to everyone right now, maybe this is a bit of a weird focus of mine, but there have been a couple of products that have had some basic success, and the industry has started to see people be able to make money and to be able to make products that people actually use and to learn from them. And over the last 5 years, as I've been working on Hum in particular, I've been paying really close attention to some of those consumer products like Muse, Dream. Muse is a meditation headset that uses very simply EEG signals, brain electricity, as well as heart rate and other things. Dream, again, EEG for sleep. And there have just been several of these, even in the neurostimulation world, and some of them have worked and it got some customers, and some of them haven't actually. But I think that, like personal computing in kind of the early 70s, and to be honest, even today, you've got to stand on the shoulders of giants and learn from these continued experiments in that space, in how to make things useful for people, how to package it, how to message it, as much as how to innovate on the technology and drive that forward by increasing the capacity to capture data or smart algorithms, these kinds of things. And so that really excites me. And I think that the potential that it has is to open the door outside the clinical stuff, to bring it into our bedrooms, into our workplaces, and make it easy to use in a way, and also not seen as a super weird thing or anything like that, in a way that can make our lives better. Because when I reflect on how I was schooled and my early time in the workforce, I really don't have much of a conscious ability to understand what's going on in our brain, and there are very limited blunt tools to improve it. So anything that gets us better tools, better products, and companies that can continue to innovate and bring these things to market makes me really excited. Even if there have been big failures, I think that that's just as exciting in a way, because it's learning what doesn't work.
Right. Well, I have a super abstract question, but I think it's something that came up as all three of you were talking. go with me for a second. During the atomic era, just the fact that we were smashing atoms revolutionized agriculture, right? People started looking at agriculture on a microscopic level. We started understanding soil and the nutrients and things like that. So they were using metaphors from another industry to apply to agriculture. We've mentioned networks, we've mentioned all these different things that are happening. I'm curious, what metaphors should we be looking for that we should be applying to BCI to help us better understand or to help us create new boundaries? I know it's a little abstract, but it's just something that, as you talked about, like the things that we're doing with artificial intelligence or the cyborgs pushing us on this reality, what are the other things we should be looking for inspiration?
I don't know how nerdy you want to get here, and we can throw some equations up if it makes the press happy, but I believe it was Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and now you're already concerned that I was being honest, had a special issue in which they looked at the metaphor, if you will, of ecological models to understand financial networks. So moving away from rational theory models and all this traditional stuff to understanding this powerful math that has been developed to understand this profound interconnectivity of incredibly high dimensional systems that have deep, deep interdependencies. Well, guess what else follows that exact same model? And in fact, as Amy was getting at, most high-profile neuroscience papers today, including papers that I would interpret in terms of being, heading towards applications of neurotechnologies, they're not really talking about what a cell is doing or thinking of the hippocampus as where memories get formed. They're looking at these big, large-scale interactive systems that are layered on top of each other. And so, I used some of these terms before, the default state network and the saliency network. And a recent paper looked at measuring in individuals the distance between their default state networks. If I asked you to do nothing and I just looked at the activity across your brain and then built almost an ecological model that says, well, what's connected to what? And then I had you do something. And in this case, it was engage in like wellness behaviors and plan around them. And then they looked at the distance between that default state connectivity across the entire brain, not a single cell, the state of the whole, and then the state of the brain when you are making the effort of thinking about engaging in healthy behaviors. And then they made a prediction. The farther those things were apart from each other, the less likely you were to actually carry through with healthier behaviors. And they were right, which then opens a big door. Well, what about technologies using transcranial alternating current stimulation or using ultrasound or what have you to make it much easier, shift the ecology to favor the person that you want to be, if you will. And so, yeah, I'm really a fan of using these ecological models because that also explains a lot of what has been so confusing about financial networks and the brain. Like, why are they so robust? Our brains shouldn't work. It's a crazy mess. When you do your first year as a neuroscientist, you're like, this whole thing is a shit show. I can't believe any of us can stand up at all. But we do, and part of it is it has this deep and profound interdependencies across all of these regions. So we got to break the habit of thinking, oh, we got a cell back here and it sees this place in the world and that's what it does. Or I've got another one up here and it specifically remembers things while I'm delaying. But that's not really what the brain is or the way we should be thinking about it. And so there you go. For me, when you say what's a metaphor, I think, well, what's a set of equations that I can use? And I love that idea of brain as an ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I love that metaphor as well. Maybe I'll offer maybe a slightly different one, building off of, sort of using perhaps some things from the natural world. I wonder if weather also isn't an interesting you know, sort of thought process in terms of even how we've as humans have begun to understand and predict, you know, things that are going to happen and states change. I think the one thing, again, to go with the network, you know, riffing on the network piece, the brain is constantly changing. It's dynamic, right? We have the ability to learn. We have the ability to unlearn. We have the ability to forget. We have the ability, like, it's to think of, you know, the brain as some snapshot, you know, in a paper with blob, 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 and blob, you know, lit up. And like, that's like a thing that it persists for, you know, it's constantly changing and flowing. And so, you know, I was just thinking of it in terms of the dynamic nature of weather, and also then thinking about, you know, states and various, you know, things that change. And maybe there are things that, you know, maybe there's climate change for the brain, right? When states get out of balance, or things happen, and disease states, you know, could be thought of, you know, in terms of those things, again, very ecological in nature. But that was, I just wanted to hit on that sort of dynamic nature. The first thing that came to mind was sort of a weather metaphor for me. So
I think about, so one of the reasons that I started working in this space was having like gone through the experience of being in college and seeing my grandma get dementia and deteriorate, and trying to go and read about it and understand what are the tools that we could be using, what are the different drugs, you know, and finding out that there's so little understanding of what was going on, and that was probably because there was so little understanding of the brain in a way, to be able to actually map the systems that were causing what was going on, what were different people experiencing, the individual differences and stuff. And I guess I had always, as a kid, been really interested in space and, like, you know, fascination with NASA, and going up in the 60s, and also in astronomy. I studied physics at university, and was majoring in astrophysics and really interested in cosmology. And some of the questions and activities involved in going to space or in mapping the stars have a similarity to me, in that they kind of seem pointless. They seem so abstract when you just encounter them for the first time. But then the act of having to be able to understand how to build a rocket to go into space, or even harder, maybe having to map cosmic inflation and understand the systems, and at the very tiny level all the way to the massive level that galaxies of the universe are assembled. The understanding that we glean in the meantime while we're working on those problems, just for the sake of discovery and invention, actually end up being incredibly useful for us. And so maybe the act of like trying to map the brain and understand the brain and build tools to use it will, you know, it's a very interesting activity. It's very hard, maybe even harder than going to space or mapping a lot of the space. But you know, often people actually give this example that the number of neurons in the human brain is pretty similar to the number of stars in the galaxy, for example. But I think in that act of exploration and then going and seeking and doing a hard thing, we uncover a lot of things that can be incredibly useful for us. And, you know, I think that the idea of going to space and building a rocket is pretty similar to the idea of building a little Neurotech device that you can call a brain-computer interface in a way.
Great. So I'm going to thank you for going with me really abstract. Let's take it a little bit more tactical. When consumers are learning about these devices, what should they be thinking about? What are the questions they should be asking themselves to understand the science?
So I'm gonna actually back up from that one step, and say I think that the offering, let's call it the offering, the product, the whatever, has to have some compelling element to it for that person to want to engage with the system, right? So if I'm going to use a device that's going to improve my memory, or improve my attention, or maybe improve my sleep or something else, I also have to have some level of self-awareness around that element of myself, or that element of my cognition or state or experience, is actually needing sort of augmentation. If you're trying to avoid just thinking about people who are just sort of randomly experimenting on themselves for fun, right? If you're thinking about an actual, consumer application. And so I think, first of all, that the explanation of the benefit and that person discovering why they might want to interact with that system is part and parcel of them then evaluating or understanding the value, veracity, standardization, whatever it is. I'm very much in favor of even devices that are going to be used for wellness or consumer applications, having conversations with the FDA, having conversations with some of the, sort of regulatory and ethical bodies to try and do that. The amount of information that people want to consume regarding the scientific quality and veracity, I think we're still figuring that out, right? And the way to present that and represent that to people in factual information ways, while simultaneously making it accessible, understandable, and relatable. So I'm not entirely sure we're there yet, but I see those two things as being held in one space together.
It's certainly something, as I transitioned from being an academic scientist to being an entrepreneur, particularly in the field of artificial intelligence, where everyone expects the AI version of a flying car. And not only is it not something that we can deliver, I kind of question the value of such a thing right at the moment. There are incredible ways that this enormously powerful tool can affect the world. It turns out literally driving your car for you is probably not one of the best examples, at least not for now. Or where I have to say, a lot of the funding in AI is gone, which is into these incredibly general purpose tools, AI companies that do what? And it's amazing to me then, as someone who's done this research, that people are pumping an enormous amount of money into it. And so someone like me gets to consume a lot of the benefits. As Ian says, it's great when companies try something and fail because I can learn from it. Nowadays, I run a philanthropic lab. So, people bring me problems and I pay for everything. We try and come up with solutions. And if we do, we just give it away. So it's wonderful that people are trying things and getting out there. But it also is this powerful lesson. And I'm going to pick fights for no particularly good reason. But when I look at, let's say, 3 of the most celebrity neurotech companies, Neuralink and Brian Johnson's company, and the recently shut down Facebook operation, what I see across them is I'm not clear what problem they were trying to solve. General BCI. They wanted the brain to be able to interact with technology, maybe so you could check your posts really easy or write them faster, because that's a problem. Or just corner the market. Wouldn't it be great to be the first Google or Facebook, but in the brain? So I get what they're after from a business standpoint, but again and again, I tell my former students going out to start their startups, ignore the platform. What's the real world problem you're trying to solve? And by the way, if you can solve it without neurotech and without AI, that's your product. Yeah. Don't overthink any of this stuff. But some things are profoundly difficult to solve. And there really is a role for these technologies in solving them. But solve it. I'll run back through the list with some real pride. Hum is focusing specifically on acuity and working memory, and Optoceutics is looking directly at Alzheimer's and the possibility of aligning it with major depression, or with mobility issues in MS, or this little niche idea of expanding creativity. Each of those is problem first, and there's a role for the brain interfacing with technology in that solution. Maybe one of those problem first companies will get out there and have developed such a strong platform to accomplish that task that they'll grow into Google or Facebook. But you know, again, as someone that does her work philanthropically, I'm going to know that we're solving problems. If you solve a real problem, the business solves some of its own problems. And so, you know, that's the one thing I try to impress most into people working in this space is don't get, I mean, I'm a sci-fi fanatic. Trust me, I got into this for all the wrong reasons. But don't just do this because you're a Neil Stephenson fan or something. Go solve a real problem in the world. There are plenty of them that neurotechnologies can help in.
Great. Ian, you want to take it really quickly before we take some questions?
Yeah, I would add, there's a really interesting element to think about, which is like, what do we need to teach, or how do we need to meet the consumer where they are? And I don't think that we really teach much neuroscience in primary school. I don't know if it's different in different parts of the world, and that's a blanket statement that I can say, but I didn't really learn it in primary school. And then, you know, we branch off into the biological science or the hard science or no science at all in some cases in high school. And I think neuroscience / neurotechnology is going to be one of these really challenging areas, a bit like people are encountering with what was formerly called IT. I think you know what I mean now. Being able to use computers and understanding networking and you know, cybersecurity and stuff. It's gonna be one of these areas where the consumer's understanding and education really is challenged because they don't really have a deep background. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about like how to meet a consumer where they are and not be patronizing and help them understand and be welcoming and stuff like that, while at the same time needing to be scientifically correct and all of these kinds of things, right? And I think it's a hard problem. It's one of those problems that I mentioned in the my mention of how it's not just the technology and the science, it's also the how do you bring it to market, and there's lots of other problems involved in there. But I just give a shout out. There are a couple of organizations that I think are doing really good work. One that I really like, and I buy people a book often, is the Sharp Brains group. And then recently I've also seen the AARP. They do
a great job.
Yeah, really, really good. I signed up because Carla told me that you didn't need to be above 60 to sign up. So I was like, okay, I'll get a card. I'll be part of the academy. What's it called? The Association for
retired people. Yeah.
Yeah. But I've been really enjoying the brain education series that they've been sending to me in an email. And I think it's really cool that older people in particular, through that email list, and Sharp Brains does a very similar thing, are getting fundamental neuroscience knowledge all the way down to hearing about studies that have happened recently and how they fit into the overall context and those kinds of things. And it's actionable too, right? Like those studies and the things that these people are learning are helping them ward off long-term neurological decay and have happier, healthier lives. So it's very meaningful, very important, very difficult, and a fascinating thing just to think about how we might approach.
Yeah.
Well,
Have
y'all
you disclosed to your board, Ian, that you've joined an association of retired people?
Not yet.
he just did it for the discount.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you. I literally have like 19 more questions I didn't get the chance to ask, but I do want to turn it over to the folks on the call to see if they have additional questions. We have about another 10, 15 minutes where we can answer things people may want to know. So feel free to unmute and ask away.
Hi, it's Sarah McBride here. I met some of you previously. Hi, Amy. We just spoke about one of your investments, and I'm calling from my car. And as you can see, I have not mastered the faux Zoom background. But I wanted to ask about FDA approvals. If the device being made is not for a medical therapy, is there a way to not get the device approved by the FDA and still sell it into the market? And then second, if a company wants to sell its device in the US, is there a rule about what portion of the trials have to be in the US? If the device has already gone through trials elsewhere, can it just come into the US without going through the trial process here? And I know for devices, there's another word for it that's sort of the equivalent of the drug trials. So I'll let whichever one of you wants to take that, answer that. Thank you so much.
You're probably the most knowledgeable of us on this topic, Amy, but I also can add about the wellness application
Yeah,
stuff.
why don't you go ahead and talk about the wellness application, and then I'll speak to some of the other stuff.
That'd be great, because that's the one that I know least. Yeah, so you can have the FDA overlook what you're doing and launch a product and not have gone through a medical device approval, which is what most people are familiar with from the FDA. The FDA set out a mechanism to be helpful, to try and help companies like my company to make claims that were substantiated and low risk, as in don't encourage people to do things that are risky. That process is called a 513G. It's just where you basically write a letter to the FDA and then they write you a letter back. And we've actually at Hum been having calls back and forth discussing updating some of the guidelines and things like that, because it's very much a developing area of consideration at the FDA. And it's not the same as a medical device approval process where you have to show there's different medical device classes that have different levels of evidence and things that are required, but some of the things that you do need to show in those medical device instances are you've manufactured things in a particular place and overseeing it properly, and other things like that. But then also that you've had clinical trials to show the evidence that a sick person can use your device. On the wellness side of things, what you get considered is have you generally approached this from a considerate method? Are you making claims that are substantiated in reality? And are you making sure that anyone who's vulnerable, who could be relying on your product and there's not enough evidence that it will help them, or that could even be hurt by the product, could use it? I think actually there's probably better scrutiny on some of this stuff in the neuroscience and neurotechnology and BCI space from the FDA than things like weird supplements for skin and hair and stuff like that. The here making pretty exploitative claims. So I think the FDA is doing the best that it can, doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, and I'll speak to some of the clinical trials work. It's certainly much more common now for companies to use, whether they're contract research organizations or other partnerships with other other clinical entities or university entities overseas. I still see a combination. I think the FDA, if certainly they accept clinical trials that happened overseas, but they have to meet all the qualifications for an FDA trial and overview in the US. And so a lot of people may start overseas. Sometimes it's easier to get things kind of rolling, see some of the early preliminary data, get a look at that, and then go ahead and set up kind of rigorous, maybe the gold standard type of trial in the US. As Ian was talking about, implantable devices, right, are always going to be class 3 FDA devices. Those will always require the most stringent approvals. Class 2 devices, which are typically the ones that maybe have electrical stimulation or EEG headsets or other type of non-invasive neuromodulation devices, sometimes those can go to market with a 510K, which is demonstrating equivalency to something that is already in the market. And so you will see the most stringent clinical trials for those class 3 devices that are invasive, and then you'll see kind of a blending of either folks going to market with a class 2 device and it has to be de novo, which means there's nothing out there that exists. So they have to kind of go through the approval process that way, or they can claim equivalency with something else that's out there. Now, of course, the more devices that are out there, the more equivalency some of the companies can claim. And I think you've seen that around, like Ian was referring to, standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Some of the companies that have come before have allowed other folks to get their devices approved much more quickly. So I hope that's helpful.
I have a couple questions, if I can. One's more general for the neuroscientists here, and one's more specific to him. I'll start with the general question. When we're talking about non-invasive devices like yours or consumer wellness devices, which obviously aren't implanted devices, we're reliant on what we know about the nervous system and what we've been able to glean over the years. I wonder if you could comment, Amy, and maybe Vivian as well, on what you see as the commonality between implanted devices, implanted BCIs, and non-invasive BCIs. What you've been able to glean so far, and what you'd like to be able to glean in the future, so that you can, enhance the functionality of consumer or non-invasive devices based on findings that have been delivered by neurosurgeons and neuroengineers who are actually implanting devices in the brain.
Yeah, I mean,
if you want to think, go for it, Amy.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, one thing comes to mind, which, is sort of on the theme, right? Which is, as we've probably all experienced, one brain does not fit all, right? If you think about the old fMRI atlases, right? And the areas, they were actually like based on 2 humans' brain anatomy, right? And then you end up mapping everything in the universe to those brains. And we know that our brains individually are quite different and really don't have a mechanism right now to kind of understand that individuality with our brains in the same way that maybe we have started to do in medicine and health and other ways. So I would say 2 things. One is, as more people interface with the brain and interface with implantables and start to understand the scope of how one kind of interfaces with the brain in that way, I think what will happen is then is that personalization, and whether that's a learning system, an AI system, and algorithmic system, that my BCI is really not a generic BCI, right? It's like my BCI, right? And it's adapted to whether it's the words I use or the things I do or things like that. So I think we're going to start to see personalization in some of the brain elements that, from the invasive perspective, that's certainly one thing. And then in the non-invasive perspective, I think having some of these things be tunable, adaptable to me, dialable. I don't know how many knobs it needs. I don't know if the setting goes to 11, I don't know, but I do think neuromodulation will also move in that direction of not necessarily one size fits all. So.
Well, one funny way to put it is, as this becomes more of an engineering and customer support problem, I think we'll suddenly find that's a real forcing function on the neuroscience world to catch up with understanding what's going on. And understanding the brain as idiosyncratic has just not been a big part of neuroscience, quite frankly, even though a lot of monkey research is like 3 monkeys in a study, and yet they really generalize, like it's all generalization from the individual. Almost nothing goes back from the general to the individual. And so, yes, that's a huge space. And there's this tension, right? One of the benefits that you get with invasive is fine detail. And so there's some wonderful work. A paper just came out last week with what they called, was it neural grains, I think? So little microtransmitter systems. They claim they could, this is a bit it was a simulation study. So they're moving in the direction, but they're claiming they could get maybe nearly 800 independently controlled read in, read out transmitters inside a rat, each independently deployed. I'm sure they have a lot of work to get to such a full system, but that level of specificity is just not something that the non-invasive technologies are close to at this point. But again, if we can kind of merge some of this together, use animal models to explore specificity and what's really going on. And then again, one of the beauties of bringing a lot of this stuff couldn't be done without deep neural networks, because doing idiosyncratic readout of people's neural activity from an EEG, let's say, that was an arcane art back in the day, and one that had to be average and average and average. The fact that you can do a thing right now, one time, and this system can understand what it's reading out, and then in a closed loop, take an action because of that, is really powerful. Big next step then would be, all right, well, skip the generic human brain. What does that mean for an individual? And here we got to bring everything in, because it's not just the neuroscience, it's the transcriptomics, because if we have genetic milieu that's a little bit different between two people, we might actually expect the neural activity to produce different transcription effects. I think about a lot of this in the context of my son, who was diagnosed 10 years ago with type 1 diabetes. And so I had this sort of notorious case of hacking his equipment and building an AI to monitor him. And what's fascinating is how interconnected it all is. So none of this involves neuroscience. And yet what we found is, we could track heart rate and activity levels and see, oh, in the morning, he was really stressed out and it was causing spikes in his blood sugar levels, and which has nothing to do with, did we dose enough or did he eat enough? It has to do with a 5-year-old getting freaked out in kindergarten. And we actually asked the school to change the way they lined up the kids. What a strange thing to think that we changed his brain by changing the way that the school was lining up the kids as evidence through blood glucose readings. Or he recently got his COVID vaccination. And while he was recovering from the immune reaction, his insulin sensitivity went up, because this big complex immune metabolic system we're a part of means that the very parts of his autoimmune disorder that are destroying the cells that make insulin were in some sense distracted dealing with the mRNA vaccine and downregulated. What I'm getting at again is these are very personal experiences. And so I strongly agree with Amy that the big frontier here, whether it's invasive, non-invasive, or even sort of near neurotechnologies. I'm doing a bunch of public health projects right now. And great new finding, chronic stress, great finding, kills huge numbers of people around the globe every year. New York Times wrote not bad about it. But in a follow-up research, this finding that the only chronic stress component we all share in common is sleep. And all these other potential factors, relationships, work, exercise, diet, those are essentially different for every one of us. So personalization, if you will, marketing has really pummeled the term personalization, unfortunately, but precision, if you want to take precision medicine, right? Understanding this unique interface that a BCI needs to be, I think, is a big next step.
Okay, and then the specific question I had for Ian, maybe you can answer this. We talked a little bit about closed loop systems and consumer EEG headsets. Obviously, there's a lot of opportunity as we learn more about in the consumer neurotech space, utilizing closed loop BCI systems, where you're taking information from an EEG and maybe modifying the stimulation paradigm in your device. Have you given thought, or are there any plans that you have to partner with or interact with some of the sensing, neurosensing companies like Emotive or Muse, or is that something that could lay down the road for him?
It's a great question. I'm really glad you asked. When I founded Hum with Tim, we actually founded it around the idea of closed loop. We were really excited by it because we looked across the broad spectrum of things that people had done with neuromodulation non-invasively, and we could see some stuff that was pretty exciting in our lab, and we could see some people who were trying to commercialize it, but we said to ourselves, this becomes really, really, really exciting if we can actually do what we were just talking about there with Amy and Vivian, like live customize it and inform it, because there are big individual variances between the effects that people notice, even with the form of neurostimulation that Hum uses. In our double-blind placebo-controlled trials, we see about 90% of people respond against the placebo. So 90% of people get better, and we don't know why. And it's like, it's consistent, that percentage, but it's not consistent the person. When you bring someone back or you bring in a new person, we don't really think that it's any of the easy to identify candidates. It's not just that someone's getting distracted psychologically or something like that. We think there are actually underlying differences between how people's brains are working that we need to address. And that's also when it becomes the closed loop and it becomes the BCI as opposed to just like very simple neurostimulation. Really cool data just coming out of the Neuroscape lab at UCSF, which is the lab where we've got Patches doing a clinical trial at the moment, is that we think that peak theta, for example, which is just like one specific brain frequency of electricity that you can measure with very simple devices like that we mentioned as consumer devices, can actually be used. You can get one biosignal or one biodata like pattern, and you can identify it pretty quickly, and then you can tune what we do with putting electricity into the brain in a way that can account for a lot of that individual variation. And that study was published at the end of August, but has been a subject of a lot of thought for us at Hum for the last couple of years, and actually even the subject of a patent or two that we filed. And I think that's where it'll start. It'll start very simple, pick up very simple patterns, and then very simple customization. And there are lots of hard problems to solve, trust me, and that's why we're one of the reasons we're not building a super complicated device. And maybe the right path in the longer term will be merging or acquiring or collaborating with an external company that is doing some more complicated work with EEG and data science. But for the moment, just with that first very simple thing that I just mentioned, customizing to peak theta, it's actually something that's quite doable for us already. A consumer device does come with problems like noise and stuff like that you get in the real world, but it's not too difficult. So we think that we're going to just focus on what we're doing for now, making the whole technology really simple and easy to understand and use and affordable and stuff like that before we dive into that deepening work. But I expect to be able to do it ourselves, and that's kind of where we plan to go in the longer term.
Well, James, you're the last person standing. Any final questions before we close things down?
No, those were my two. Thanks for putting this together. Sounds really interesting. So, yep, look forward to having y'all keep us up to date on what's going on with the company, or what's going on in related fields that you think we should know about. And just as a reminder, if I haven't told you, our 20th anniversary Neurotech Leaders Forum is coming up on November 8th and 9th. Lord willing, back in San Francisco, but it'll probably be a hybrid event again with some people online and some people in person. But if you can make it, we'd love to have you back in.
I'll be there for sure.
Super.
Good.
Great. Well, thank you all. I really appreciate it. I will send out the recording later to everybody and hopefully a transcript too.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thanks,
Right.
Ian. Thanks, Vivian.
Very scary to talk on a panel with two such intelligent people. So.
All good. Thanks, my friend.